Chris Papps has learned taxpayers in 2024 gave Maryland Public Schools hundreds of millions of dollars to educate students whose whereabouts were unknown.
So one of the greatest lies across American society is the lie of education being defunded. Massive cuts to public education is why we have declined in terms of education quality in comparison to the rest of the world. And in reality, you can't expect first-class results when you're giving them a 10th class budget. Now, obviously, this is fake. This is fraudulent. This is ridiculous. In fact, in each and every state in the union, what we see is that K through 12 spending, if not the number one thing in every state's budget, is at least in the top two. And the reason for that is because spending has actually gone up on public education exponentially throughout our history, even though the results have gotten significantly worse. But what about the achievement gap? We've been told throughout our history that education is funded by property taxes. And since minority areas live in poor areas that actually have low property values, it just is a fact that the public schools in these poor urban areas are actually significantly underfunded due to the fact that, of course, they're just not getting enough money in terms of property tax revenue. This is also a myth, and we talked about why this is a myth multiple times on this channel. Essentially, what we saw in the state of New Jersey is that they had a series of court decisions called Abbott decisions, which said it was unconstitutional under New Jersey state law to underfund these minority student schools. And what ended up happening is that state funding ended up flooding these areas to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, and ultimately education outcomes, despite the fact that funding was normalized and these decisions happened back in the 80s, did not improve. It did not actually solve the problem because, again, the problem is in our education system itself. And in fact, oftentimes when you see a failing or declining school system in a left-wing area, you'll find out that they are among the top funded school systems in that particular area. And a perfect example of this is Baltimore, which ranks in the top 5 each and every year. It's gotten as high as top 3 in the entire country. However, we track that by per pupil spending, but what this recent report actually discovered out of the city of Baltimore is that many of those pupils that we are dividing the spending across actually don't exist. They're ghost students that are only there for accounting purposes in order to draw in more state and federal funding. And what we're going to talk about today is this Project Baltimore segment that essentially breaks down the unmasking of this fraud that, again, is not just affecting the taxpayers of Baltimore or Maryland, but the federal government, meaning all of us, and how the teachers union is fighting against reforms that would stop this from happening. But before we get into that, I want to thank everybody for funding me and my life and my education over on actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Maryland Public Schools right now are busy, not just educating students, but counting them. In Maryland, most of a school's funding is based on the number of students enrolled on September 30th. The students counted on that one day largely determines a school's funding the following year.
Now, for those of you who are familiar with HBO's The Wire, which by the way aired from 2002 to 2008, what you just heard right there about the one day a year where they end up counting the number of students in order to determine the allocation of funding sounds extraordinarily familiar. And yes, this is a practice that, despite the fact it was depicted as a very corrupt process, again, in a TV series that aired in the mid-2000s, is still practiced to this very day. And of course, if you are familiar with the scenes from The Wire, what you find out is that truancy enforcement really kicks into gear on this specific day to make sure that the school has as many students as humanly possible in order to ensure that the city of Baltimore's public schools gets the most funding humanly possible. But the thing is, what we end up discovering is that many of the students that they round up, again, just like the TV series from The Wire, 20 years ago this aired exposing this fraud, actually don't show up except for this one individual day, and all of that excess money is utilized by the schools in ways that they want, and of course goes to pay off key constituents like the teachers union, because guess what? The business of public education has nothing to do with the children in public education. It has everything to do with giving jobs and protecting those who are the adults working in public education. So again, we see this right here still playing out. 2025. I'm pretty sure that education season was like season 3 or season 4. So we're talking 2005, 6, or 7 this aired, warning us about this scheme, and it has not been resolved.
But a Project Baltimore investigation is raising serious questions about that process. We've learned in 2024, taxpayers gave hundreds of millions of dollars to schools to educate students who could not be found. In total, in 2024, more than 891,000 Maryland students were counted on September 30th. Throughout the year, according to the Maryland State Department of Education, about 14,500 students unenrolled in grades 7 through 12. The documented reasons students unenrolled range from illness to employment, but the biggest category by far is whereabouts unknown. Look at that number. Nearly 11,000 students were unenrolled because the school could not find them.
So the local news media gives you a breakdown of what I just explained to you and highlighted as something that was featured in The Wire, again, decades ago, but they give you the numbers for this most recent year, and what you ultimately end up discovering is that around 11,000 students are missing, even though they were present on September 30th in the Maryland education system, even though, again, there's funding attached to them. And if we put those 11,000 students that, by the way, are disproportionately located in Baltimore, which has one of the larger school districts, but also has one of the larger missing students rate, and we actually look at the cost to educate per pupil in that state, what we find out is that it's around $21,000 in terms of per pupil spending for the Baltimore area, which ends up working out to around $220 million that is being spent on students that aren't present. Do you guys get the game now? Do you guys get what's going on? Do you guys get why rapid truancy enforcement happens on September 30th, but never before and never after that particular date? There's a reason for it. There's a rationale for it. It's all a tactic. And guess what? When hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake, you understand why that tactic is deployed that way. And make no mistake about it, we end up having these count days in every single jurisdiction across the country. It just so happens that Baltimore is one of the more known for basically corrupting this process because it's on a set day each and every year, and the entire city government ends up participating in it. But it is happening in and around your area, and if your city did not get a hit HBO series based on it, chances are you have a similar coordination going on between your local government, the police department, and of course the public school teachers union.
Maryland schools in 2024 received nearly $20,000 per student, meaning local and state taxpayers gave public schools statewide around $219 million in just 1 year to educate students whose whereabouts were unknown. And that amount does not include federal funding.
Now, I give my estimation of 220 million, and that's because, of course, I rounded up the students to 11,000, but as you saw in the chart, it's actually technically 10,077, and this is just the students unknown. Remember, there's about 4,000 more students that are not attending school that are counted on that September 30th day, but what we end up discovering is that that money specifically is just the state and local money. It doesn't even include the federal government money, which also ends up paying out big bucks in order to cover the students that are counted under that specific counting day.
Unacceptable for taxpayers' money to go for students that are knowingly not in the school system.
Now, one of the reasons why I love Fox 45's series Project Baltimore is that they've been on it for years. They're one of the best local news agencies in the entire country, and I actually recommend that you guys subscribe to this particular series because they do stellar work, and I honestly benefit tremendously from their reporting. And a perfect example of this is the fact that they've been on this particular story since 2021. They've been covering it. that's when this interview of this guy, if you look at the top of the screen, actually comes from. But they actually go back further into the records in order to document this. Again, something that was documented very well on a hit HBO series. Maybe they don't got cable, maybe they don't got premium channels over in Baltimore, but this is well known for decades. But of course, it's actually getting worse. So as you can see by this particular chart, we have an increase in the students whose whereabouts were unknown from 2019 all the way to 2024. We have about 6,100 in 2019. In 2020, that's the COVID year, so they didn't really measure in the way that they would. We have 7,200 in 2021, 8,700 in 2022, 9,900 in 2023, and then 11,000 in 2024. Now, the whereabouts unknown is a very nebulous category, and I know some people are going to point to the homicide rate in Baltimore, although it's dropping under Ivan Bates. I understand it's disproportionately youth. I understand it's disproportionately black youth, but there's no way, shape, or form that this is all covered by the homicide stats. This is just kids not showing up to school, disappearing, being ghost kids in the first place, again, in order to extract so much additional funding. If you guys will recall, there was a movie that was released in and around 2011 called The Cartel, which actually documented the corruption in just the New Jersey public school system. And one of the things that you'll find out is that with the additional money that is flooded into the school system, oftentimes you'll have positions that don't exist, staff salaries that just are going to no one, and all these other things, which are basically mechanisms for individuals within the school system in order to steal this excess money that's going in there. And having 11,000 ghost kids is a perfect example of how you would get away with this.
Following our reporting on missing students in 2021, Carroll County Delegate April Rose introduced legislation to count students 4 times a year to increase accuracy.
So look, we get the listing of the entire problem, and then we get a proposed solution, which is of course the state of Maryland mandating that you count not just 1 day out of the year, but 4 days out of the year. You take that average score, and then you ultimately allocate funding based on that. So that way the students that are enrolled are not being dragged into school just to be counted, only to cut class and drop out a day later, but they're actually there for the entire school year to make sure that, again, taxpayer funding actually is spent responsibly. And considering you're getting this number in order to allocate funding for the next year's school year, this should be no problem to pull off. But of course, the teachers union, like I warned you about earlier, is opposed to this because more money, more staffers, more teachers in the classroom, more union members, that machine keeps growing, and they don't want to risk that $219 million that they're getting for 11,000 students that don't exist.
Opponents, such as the teachers union, said the bill overcomplicates a data snapshot that is intended to ensure adequate funding for schools.
Now look, everybody should know by now that corruption and Baltimore go hand in hand, but it's also important to understand that corruption as it relates to the teachers union is usually a statewide problem because, again, education is usually the biggest item in any state legislature's budget, and whenever you have any kind of huge dollar amount going out to one particular constituency, they are going to do absolutely everything possible in order to make sure the money is flowing. This is why, despite the fact that Westmore was facing a giant budget deficit and Maryland taxes were already high, they threw out these crazy new assessments in order to charge people more money in order to cover it, rather than cutting this obvious waste that you could cut that, again, would be made much easier if you actually counted students 4 times a year. Again, a very simple procedure that could actually amend some of these problems they're not doing because the teachers union is that powerful. Now, of course, I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below, considering it's not just the state taxpayers, but it's also federal dollars. I want to know what you think if you're a taxpayer in the United States of America. But as per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Baltimore's obvious education corruption. Till next time.